Hey, what's going on? Chad here, and I'm making this video in response to a question somebody had. And the question goes something like this: why has God created some people with disabilities? Now, before I get into answering this question, I would just like to start off by saying that I'm highly indebted to my personal hero in the faith, Ravi Zacharias, whom I have learned a great deal of the amount of information that I'm going to be using in order to attempting to answer this question. So let's go ahead and get into it. Why has God created some people with disabilities? Now, in order to understand the answer to this question, we ought to go back to the beginning. The beginning when God created man. It says when God created man, He created man in His image. And He looked and He saw what He created. He saw that it was good. Now, the people with disabilities today are not a direct result of what God had created, which was in His image and which was good. However, the people with disabilities today are a result of man using his free will to act in disobedience to God, which introduced sin into the world and put us in the fallen state that we're in now. Alright, so that's the answer right there. It's really quite simple, that the people with disabilities today, the blame is not to be laid at the feet of God, but the blame is to be laid at humankind, who sinned, who used disobedience against God and has put the world in the fallen state that it's in now. So now that we have the answer, let's go ahead and just look at a couple different avenues on trying to maybe just understand a way to cope with what we have before us now. Alright, so the same sin that separates us from the Creator has also taken over mankind in all different kinds of shapes and sizes, like a cancerous plague. Some of us are sick, some of us have poor eyesight, some of us have no eyesight, some of us are deaf, some of us have physical conditions, heart conditions. Now compare these people with these physical disabilities to some people that we would say don't necessarily have the physical disabilities. Some people that have 20/20 eyesight, however they don't see the things that God wants them to see. Some people that have what we would call good hearing, however they don't listen to what the Spirit has to say. Some people that have hearts that are strong and powerful and can run marathons, however their hearts are hardened, they are seared. They don't soften to the things that God has done for them, to the sacrifice that Christ has done on the cross. Do you see what I'm trying to contrast here? Is that these people with disabilities that we could see from the outside looking in, it seems like such a bad thing, but perhaps, just maybe, it could be found to be some sort of a blessing in disguise. It's a result of a fallen world, but maybe we could see the good in it. And I'll give a story here towards the end of this video in which you can kind of see some of the good in somebody's suffering, because when suffering's happening in our own lives, it's so hard to understand and to comprehend the good that can be going on inside. But when we look at it in somebody else's life and we see how God pulls the threads together in that life to create something beautiful, we can better understand it. So I'm going to give a little story at the end. Now, taking these things into consideration, alright, the question becomes, who really has it worse? Who has it worse? The person with the physical disability or the person that has the spiritual disability? The person that's so distracted by the world. I mean, look at the rich and the famous people that have what seems like everything going for them today. They are so caught up, they are so absorbed in the world that they're not looking for God, they're not listening for Him. I mean, take the way that Jesus put it with the rich man. He says that it's more difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. I mean, do you see what he's saying? Why is he saying that? Because the rich man is going to be so caught up, he's going to be so absorbed into that money that he's not going to be listening for God. He's not going to be looking for God. So, taking that into consideration, human disabilities and death, you know, it's a sorrowful thing to the believer, but not as to those without hope. If we could somehow get the right perspective of God and our finite problems, listen guys, that's exactly what our finite problems become, just only finite problems. One of America's greatest preachers, he was also known as the Great Illustrator. This guy, he was never shorthanded for a story until his wife died. And when his wife died, his little girl came up to him and she asked him, "Daddy, you always told me that Jesus died on the cross so that we wouldn't have to die. Well, if Jesus died on the cross, Daddy, why did Mommy have to die?" The father was stunned by the context of the little girl's question, and he says, "You know what, honey? Why don't you let me think about that for a little while?" So, on the day of the funeral, they were driving in the car on the way to the cemetery. It was a bright and sunny day. The sun was shining on the road, and there in front of the funeral car, there's a very large sort of tractor-trailer truck stopped at a traffic light. The sun was shining down on the truck, and a shadow was being cast on the sidewalk. And the great illustrator, he turned to his daughter and says, "Honey, if you had to be run over today, would you rather be run over by the truck, or would you rather be run over by the shadow?" She looked at him in her wisdom and said, "Daddy, naturally the shadow. I'd rather the shadow run me over. It wouldn't hurt as much as the truck." He says, "Dear, that's what Jesus has done for us. He died on the cross. The truck of God's judgment went over him. Only the shadow goes over you and me now." Do you get that? The truck of God's judgment ran over him, and only the shadow goes over us now. Now, in regards to disabilities, they are not the final say. They are not the last word. Jesus did not come to make bad people better people. When he came and he died on the cross, he came to make dead people live, okay? Please listen to this poem now by a Christian woman by the name of Annie Johnson Flint. This is the story that I said I was going to share about how we could see how God can use the threads and pull them together in somebody's life that is going through a time of suffering, who is going through some serious disability. Maybe you could see the beautiful thing God's done with this woman's life. So, Annie Johnson Flint, she was born in a home where at a very young age she lost her mother. Shortly after, she lost her father and was brought up and raised in the home of the Flint family. After she graduated college, she contracted arthritis in one of its most crippling forms and was bedridden, not for a couple of years, but for decades of her life. It was not bad enough that she had lost control of her organs and became incontinent. She spent many of her years on diapers. And if that were not humiliating enough for her, she began to become blind, and cancer began to take its toll. Here's a woman, she's orphaned, she's arthritic, incontinent, she's blind, lying here almost motionless in bed. One eyewitness wrote a book titled The Making of the Beautiful, and said the last time that he saw her, she had 7 pillows cushioning her body to keep her supported from indescribable agony. Alright, she wrote a hymn, and this is how it goes. He giveth more grace as our burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength as our labors increase. To added afflictions he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials he multiplies peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limits, his grace has no measure, his power no boundary known to men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again. If we could somehow get the right perspective of God and our finite problems, that's exactly what our finite problems become. Just finite problems. Human disabilities are not the final say. He's died so that we may live. And these human disabilities are not a direct result of what God has created, but he certainly has the solution. The same God that has created life, a life that with its free will has defaced itself, God has the power to restore that life. So I hope this helps in answering the question. It just maybe gives a little bit of a perspective of, the possible answers that are out there. All right, thanks for listening, guys.